the number of kids with IEPs is probably bigger now. I think it's on average about 13% of students now
Mm-hmm.
across the nation. But you have schools, some of the schools we work with, I think they're probably at 25% or something like that.
Right.
So there are lots of kids with IEPs, which is challenging. And one of the reasons it's so challenging is because the focus is so much on compliance. It's just the plan says X, and therefore we're going to be, you know, um, we're going to be monitored as to whether we're doing X.
Right.
And it doesn't always focus on the things that are the most important.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to another episode of the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today, we are joined by Betsy Hill. Betsy, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Great to see you guys.
Likewise.
Yeah, we're glad to have you now. Betsy, let's get to know you a little bit first. So I'm going to start off with the loaded question. Who is Betsy Hill?
Well, the first thing I usually tell people, because it's the most important, is I'm the mother of 3 boys. And I learned everything I know from raising them, just about. And I'm now also a grandmother. I have 2 absolutely adorable granddaughters. And I'm a recovering educator, which I started off in the classroom many, many years ago, and then became discouraged, as many teachers do, and left for a while. I've taught now at multiple levels. I teach in graduate school programs and teach a lot of adults in professional development in schools, and have just always been fascinated by the brain and how we learn. And we didn't know anything back when I was studying. I taught foreign languages, and I took the psychology of language and I took the philosophy of language. There was no science of language. There was no science of learning. But today we know how the brain learns, or we know a lot about it. We it's much, much more to discover, but we know enough to know how it can help us be better teachers, better parents, help us be much better learners. And really that's what I've had the great fortune to be doing and be studying and be involved in for the last 20 years or so.
Now, I kind of want to unpack what you said there a little bit earlier, just in terms of being a recovering educator. So why is it that you think, you can speak to your own experience as well, but why do you think teachers are leaving the field?
Well, I think that teachers are leaving the field in droves these days, especially since COVID. I think COVID started some of it. What I see, and when I talk to educators, which I do a lot, is that teachers are discouraged. They're getting so much pressure to help kids and to do so many things. You have to cover this and you have to teach that, and you can't do, but and they're all here's the have do's, and then here are the can't do's. You can't do this and you can't do that, and you have to do it the way and it's just it's not they know they can't be successful, and what teachers really care about is kids and helping them. And when you feel like your hands are tied, but the expectations are very high and the resources just aren't there. So they get, more and more demands on what they need to cover and accomplish, and less real tools that they need to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I was mentioning to you, I've just started as an educational assistant, and I have seen that there was a day that I was working, and you have a teacher who's trying to teach a class of grade 4s, right? And get through the lessons, all the haves, everything that he has to do. But then you have a child who his behavior is now impacting the whole entire classroom. So you start talking and trying to do your math lesson, which is already difficult, and kids, are already struggling, and then you're being interrupted every couple of minutes, right? So then the teacher now has to stop. I have to intervene with the student. And it's so, you see how, as a student, even it would be frustrating trying to learn, let alone a teacher sometimes. And then you take out the fact, if you even have an educational assistant in the classroom,
Right.
that you get that sense of not feeling like they're accomplishing much during the day because of everything that they have to deal with on top of all these lessons and
Right.
the have-tos, as you
Yeah.
say.
And then there's the active shooter drill and the tornado drill and the standardized testing and all these things that take up a lot of time, but that are and they're not like they're not important and they're not
Right.
the role, but it does make it hard to focus. And you talk about that child who was misbehaving. One of the things that I think most teachers know, and I'm not sure whether other people necessarily appreciate it, is that sometimes behavior and academics are really the same thing. We talk about them as if they're two separate things. Oh, the class couldn't learn because somebody was misbehaving. But in a lot of cases, if we investigated what was going on with that child who was disruptive, they probably were having difficulty learning, and learning challenges when you're not getting it the way it's coming at you. Kids tend to do two things, one of which is they shut down, which is easier in some senses for the teacher because it's usually quiet and they just sit there and, don't do anything. Or they act out, and then that's disruptive, and then the teacher has to do something because it impacts everybody in the classroom. But they can be just two different manifestations of the same problem, which is that child wasn't learning to begin with because they had some underlying, usually cognitive weaknesses. So what we do is all about helping people understand and then improve cognitive skills. So the cognitive skills are the how of learning. So you've seen a lot of the what of learning. We have to cover math. We have to do this type of math problem and teach the children this procedure and whatever. But the how they learn it is a whole different question. And it's how our brains operate and take in and store and retrieve information. And those mental processes are referred to as cognitive skills. And they include things that we talk about all the time, like attention, and whether kids can, pay attention, and as well as memory skills, visual processing, auditory processing. And those are all, everybody is unique. We all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses. But in most classrooms, we treat everybody as if they were a widget, as if they were exactly the same. And we present them the math material. We make everybody do the same kinds of problems. And we just hope that they're going to, master that content. But it doesn't happen a lot for lots and lots of kids.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I guess, is it safe to say then that the traditional learning environment where we have a teacher standing at the front of a classroom using a whiteboard or whatever, and just having everybody kind of aligned, sitting and listening, not necessarily the ideal learning environment for everyone?
It's not an ideal learning environment for almost anyone, actually. So if you think about when we interact with information, so like we're in a classroom, if we're seeing, and now having a whiteboard is better than not having anything, because at least we have something to look at as opposed to just listen to. And so our brains store information where it's processed. So we don't have like this storage vault in our brains where we go, stick things on the shelf and pull them back out. Our brains actually store information where it comes in. So if we're seeing something, it gets stored in the back of our heads in the occipital lobe, which is where visual processing happens. If we're listening, it happens in the temporal lobes. If we're doing something with it, acting, doing something physically, then the top part of our brain, which is where the motor activity, motor cortex is. And if we're deciding and really thinking deeply and relating to things consciously, then it happens in the front of our brains. So you think about how will our brains have the best shot at getting that material back out and remembering it? If we can store it in multiple areas, we have a lot more ways to retrieve it. So it's a really simple kind of, and simplistic in some ways, explanation, but it is nonetheless true. So if all we're doing is sitting and listening, we're not engaging. The best way to really make sure you learn something is to teach it, to explain it to somebody else. So who's the one who knows the material the best in that classroom? It's a teacher, right? The teacher is constantly explaining. The teacher knows that stuff, but unless we give our students a chance to do something with it, to think about it, to apply it, to act it out, to create a model of it, to whatever, it's the chances that they will remember it are just not nearly as good.
So then I guess as a teacher or even as a parent trying to teach something to your children, so it sounds like you want to engage multiple levels of cognition, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, multiple senses. We call it multimodal learning or multisensory content. Yeah, it's always the best way to do that. And you don't have to use all of them all the time, but just to be conscious of not doing one. And most teachers, and I have the same thing. I have to think very consciously. Otherwise, we just sort of lapse into our comfort learning modes. And you get me started and I can talk about things that I am interested in and explain them. But when I give somebody else an opportunity. So what you did right now was ask me a question. You restated what you were hearing, which is a great way. If we can ask our students to do something as simple as that. So tell me in your own words what you just, thought I said. And you did it sort of instinctively, but that's a very powerful learning tool.
Something I've seen just working in the classroom is, and hearing from teachers, that kids aren't, I guess you could almost say they're not confident in their work and what it is they're doing. So they almost just get stuck at a wall. A lot of them aren't really having the courage to keep going, even if it may not be right. Like they almost want that hand holding. And obviously very difficult to do with one teacher in a classroom of however many students, right? And you see that, and the teacher I was talking to, he's like, I'm really just trying to teach them that they can go on even if the question isn't right. Like you want to teach them to be able to have the tools to think through these math questions or write down these sentences, even if the spelling's wrong. Have you been seeing that in classrooms where the kids are lacking that self-esteem to do their work?
Self-confidence and having confidence in your own ability to learn are big issues for lots and lots of kids. And a lot of times it's because they are not strong in, they may struggle with attention and focus, or they may struggle with visual versus verbal information. So, and we don't tend to encourage students to take to learn about how they learn best and then to apply that understanding. So, simple example, we can distinguish between verbal memory and visual memory. So some of us, it's easier to remember something we see, and for some of us, it's easier to remember something that's language-based, that we hear or that we read. So my verbal memory is better than my visual memory. If I need to remember, for example, the screen that I'm seeing, which is, your Disrupt the Everyday podcast logo and the pictures and the whatever, I have to describe it. So there's a medium blue background and it's a sort of I don't know what kind of, it's all caps font with the title. So when I put it into words, that's going to help me remember. And now tomorrow, if you ask me what this looked like, I would be able to tell you because I'm putting it into words. For other people, they can see an image of it. And if I described it, they would have to actually sort of create the image and really work at visualizing it to remember it. So now think about a typical assignment we might get in school to learn some new vocabulary. And so, and you're probably thinking to yourselves, I'd be interested to hear what you guys each say about what you think your strongest skill is in terms of memory. And so a typical assignment for vocabulary is the teacher will ask you to write the word, write the definition of the word, and write the word in a sentence. Did you ever get that kind of assignment?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think we probably all did. Well, that's an absolutely great learning technique for someone who's got wonderful verbal memory, because it's all about words. Now think of a child who has very poor verbal memory, but great visual memory. That assignment's going to be excruciating for them. It's going to be really hard to do. They will struggle with it. And at the end, it's not going to help them remember or learn that vocabulary. And you can probably, think of a much better way to do that. Just about everybody says, oh, well, why don't you just have them draw pictures? Absolutely. Absolutely. Far more productive, far better use of their time, and far more effective in helping them learn. So that's sort of the why it's so important and how we can really make those distinctions. So I think part of, that lack of confidence in the classroom is that part of it's not understanding that everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Part of it is having a lot of variability. So I can be strong in some areas and weak in others, but if I don't know how to connect that to my learning, every learning experience is unpredictable and therefore makes us anxious. A lot of anxiety associated with those situations. So, and the other part of that is there's a term that we use called growth mindset. You may have you familiar with that? Okay.
Yes.
So it's based on the work of Carol Dweck, and what it really says is when we know, because we do from a scientific point of view, that intelligence is not fixed and that our talents develop and we can always improve them. But kids don't always know that. And in fact, many adults don't. And we all have, nobody has a perfect growth mindset, but that true, internalizing that belief that you can learn and that you just have to try something maybe a little bit different, or you have to practice it and you'll eventually be able to get it. That's not something that the education system always promotes and encourages and develops and nurtures. If you get it wrong, you get a D or an F, right? Or you don't pass the test. You got that big red letter on your paper. Far better to skip those letter grades and just write, not yet. You haven't quite done it yet. Yet's a very powerful word. And so if we approached it that way and really encouraged kids not just to go back and try again, but to go back and try again with maybe a little different strategy or with a little different spin on things, or to think creatively, to brainstorm. And we don't explain to them how to do that. We don't give them practice, and we don't give them really that direction. So I completely agree with that teacher about that we want to do that. But I think sometimes we have to be a little more explicit with our students to help them actually do that. It was a really long-winded answer.
No, I like that and appreciate the whole yet, right? Because it's true. It's the same with adults. We may do a job and it might not be done right, but once you get those tools, you do go back and do it again. And I think something else that can impact this, and like that classroom I was just thinking of, is when the class community and the dynamics are not that great. I think that definitely increases that, the lack of self-confidence, right? Like if people don't feel comfortable amongst their peers and making their mistakes, then you're going to have a whole bunch of students that just freeze and don't want to keep going. Right.
Right.
And I mean, I guess that's another thing that teachers, that's their responsibility, is creating that safe classroom community as well, which can be challenging.
Absolutely. Emotions are an incredibly important part of learning. We think that learning is just rational, but emotions play a tremendous role on both sides of the coin. So they can, as you we're discussing, it can definitely be, learning experience can be very challenging. It can be anxiety producing. We probably all remember that day when we hadn't studied and we just, praying that the teacher didn't call on us. Yeah. Well, and what happens then is our bodies react to that situation like any threat, like a physical threat. So psychological threats can be just as devastating as physical threats. So our bodies have the same reaction as that fight or flight mode. And our palms get sweaty and our hearts start to race, and we get jittery and all those kinds of things. And those are all from an evolutionary point of view, useful adaptations, because they get us ready to run away from that man-eating tiger. And our bodies don't really distinguish between a man-eating tiger and a standardized test or the teacher calling on us. So we have to learn that and get better at it. But the teacher does play a big role in creating that kind of atmosphere. On the other side, positive emotions are also really powerful in learning. And if you don't want too much, but it's some of the same chemicals in our brains, like adrenaline, where you'd like to have the kids so engaged that they're on the edge of their seats, because what that does is it actually strengthens memory. It creates stronger memories when we have those when they're really engaged, they're really excited about something. So got to pay attention to both sides. You don't want everybody just, being too chill.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, no, but since you mentioned engagement, one thing that I've been able to, I guess, ascertain coaching basketball to 11, 12, and 13-year-old boys for the last year. And also, actually, I was at another practice yesterday, just listening to a coach. And one of the things he said when he had everybody together was, all eyes on me, both eyes and both ears should be on the coach while I'm talking. So or else you're not paying attention. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this, because I think my feeling has kind of evolved on that. And it's a little bit different. I think not every kid's the same in how they focus or pay attention.
Yeah, that's really true. I do know there are lots of kids, we think they're not, and I hear this from parents all the time. My child just isn't listening to me. A lot of the time they are listening. They just aren't cueing you into that. A lot of kids actually find it easier to listen and to absorb the message, if they're not distracted by something visual. So on the other hand, it's really helpful to tell kids what you want them to pay attention to. Teachers, we often say, okay, kids, or students, I want you to pay attention. Well, we're always paying attention, just maybe not to what the teacher wants us to. So being more explicit, I want you to watch my hands and my expression, because I'm going to demonstrate to you how you do X. So if you tell them what you want, not just look at me,
right,
but look at me doing X, because I really want you to, pay attention to that. because otherwise it's very surprising. We all see things and experience things based on our individual backgrounds and perception and experience. There's a wonderful story that I have, and I use it in my presentations, in a picture of 3 cows, but one is standing behind the other. So it sort of looks like a cow with extra legs, And a second grade teacher asked his students what it was a picture of. And they mostly agreed that it was 2 cows and that one had more legs. And then they had all kinds of explanations. That must be a cow from another country. That must be twins, like conjoined twins. That must be, a person in a costume. So completely different interpretations of things. So people see, this is what the kids were seeing. And they could tell you what they thought they were seeing, but it wasn't necessarily what anybody else would have said. So we sometimes forget that, and we assume that because the students are looking at us and we've asked them to look at our, eyes and ears on me kind of thing, that they're seeing and hearing what we want them to. But even that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I know, just again, from my experience, that there was one kid, the number of them their eyes will wander off, but one kid in particular was like looking at his feet, and I thought he just missed everything I said. So I was like, hey, did you hear the instructions? He's like, yeah. I was like, okay, what did I just say? And he was able to say everything back to me that I'd said. And again, he hadn't looked at me the entire time I was speaking. So it kind of helped me make that realization.
So we've talked about teachers and the classroom there, and now we're going into summer break. And for people in the States, they're already on summer break. So looking at the parents, and as parents, how can we help our children and with their learning abilities?
So, we can write a book about that. And in fact, we did write a book about that.
I was going to say.
Yeah. So the first thing is to recognize that school doesn't have all the answers. We always assume as parents, or we do this a lot, that school will take care of it. Whatever's happening, if my child's having a struggle or an issue, that the school will notice it before I will, and will just take care of it. But that actually doesn't happen most of the time. And so as parents, when we see something going on where our child is, struggling, resisting doing homework, becomes unhappy, shuts down, all those kinds of things, usually we're noticing that, and it's really more obvious. So that's number one, is to realize that as parents, it's our responsibility, first and foremost. Parents need to really try to understand how their children do learn, how strong their cognitive skills are. And there are assessments and tools to do this. You can start with something free that, for example, we on our website have a cognitive rating scale that parents can use, mybrainware.com. So if you go there and just type rating scale or cognitive rating scale into the search bar, it'll take you, and there's ones for different ages. And it's, not an official formal assessment, but it does do a good job of giving you an idea about sort of some of the cognitive areas where your children are stronger and not as strong. And then there are ways to do that more with a formal assessment, where you really understand very objectively, scientifically, how strong your child's skills are. So once we do that, then the next step is really to take that information and to help our kids understand how they learn best. So we start to understand it, and we can give them strategies to help them. And I talk to kids a lot when we do a formal cognitive assessment. So we know a lot about how they learn, what their strengths are, what their weaker areas are. And when I talk to kids about it, I tell them, I always start with their strength. And I will tell them, this strength is your learning superpower. And it's like being a superhero with a cape. And it's just right there in the closet for you whenever you need it. And you can go and put it on. So any learning situation, this is going to help you. And then we give them strategies, just like we talked about with learning vocabulary words. We're going to adapt those strategies and give them something that's specific for how they learn best. And when they know that, and when they practice those strategies, they become much better at them. And then they know and they have confidence when they go into the classroom and into those learning situations. And so you're much more likely to have them, bring out those strategies and be more confident when they approach those. So Tanya, you were talking about that teacher who had kids that he really wanted them to take things a little bit further and be, try things even though they didn't know. Mm-hmm. If they know not exactly how to do it, but they understand how they learn best and they can apply that, then we'll approach all those situations with much more confidence.
Excellent. Now, since you kind of mentioned those learning superpowers, I'm just curious if we think in terms of like neurodiversities, do you happen to see any trends? Like, just hypothetically, let's say there's a child with ADHD. Do they tend to have learning strategies or learning superpowers that are kind of consistent with that?
That's a great question, Brian. And the answer is that labels like ADHD or autism or dyslexia or whatever, but particularly the first two, do two things for you. They give you access to medication and to a prescription you have to have a diagnosis to get a prescription. So that's one thing it does. And that's the healthcare side. In the education side of things, it might give you access to accommodations under an individualized education plan, an IEP, or a 504 plan, which provides accommodations. But it doesn't really tell us how that child learns. And this is the interesting part. People sort of assume, well, if you have ADHD, you must struggle with attention. Well, people with ADHD may struggle with attention, but many times I see them perform very well on the attention portion of a cognitive assessment. And we might see difficulty with processing speed, or we might see difficulty with working memory or some other cognitive skill. And so, we know when we work with a lot of kids with those diagnoses, but we can't draw that, direct line comparison to a learning challenge or a learning strength either way. Just doesn't work. But people assume that, and they say, okay, well, you've got ADHD, therefore we, treat you X way in terms of, and we probably give you, a carbon copy IEP to go with it if you're in school, and that's just not going to help.
Now, another thing I'd be curious about as well is written notes versus typed notes, because I know, growing up, I didn't have a computer a laptop at my desk or a Chromebook or whatever to take notes on. Everything had to be written. And one of the things that I learned a while back, and I don't know how true this is, but if you're writing notes there, you're making that, it's helping kind of cement those things in your mind because you're hearing the information, you're writing the information down. So you have to take some kind of action there with it as well. But
I believe there is some evidence to do for that, but I don't think it's also. Again, I think there's a lot of variability in. Some kids will do much better taking much more visual notes, graphic organizer kind of approach, versus words. Some. I doodle a lot. I scribble and whatever. That's really what helps me. sustain my attention when I'm, deeply listening to something as opposed to just sitting really quietly. So and sometimes music can help too. There's a lot of variability. And the most important thing probably to share about whatever notes it is that you take is what you do with them when it's time to study for the test.
Right.
So most people read through their notes. They read them over. And that is not a very efficient way to study. Far more efficient it would be to summarize it, to explain it to somebody else, again, to be more proactive, not just passive. There's a principle called effortful recall, which is when we have to stretch to try to remember something, it helps strengthen the memory of that thing. And so when, in school, teachers used to call them quizzes, right? And the quiz was partly for the teacher to know whether you'd learned something, but also for you to learn whether you. And so when at home, when you're doing it for yourself to study for a test, I suggest calling it recall practice. So, we're not trying to gotcha or whatever, but when we make it harder to recall, or we make it, have to make that effort to recall that information, it makes it much more memorable. So what you should do is either do flashcards or, create some kind of, diagram, or organize your notes or color code your notes, do something active with them that then will be more memorable.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful you said that, because sometimes, if I sit down and help the kids study, I do it how, I was taught to study. And yeah, it's the whole writing down and memory, but not going about it the way that you were explaining, right? Or even just having them, if you have a child that doesn't want to sit and study at home, asking them to sort of tell you about the subject and go over it and all that, because I can see for one of our kids that would definitely be way more beneficial with less fuss than having him sit down and try to, fill out the blanks and stuff like that.
Yeah. And you can have a lot of fun with that as a parent, because you can pretend to be really dumb. Like, what was the Civil War? Why did they do that? You don't have to know anything about it to get them talking about and explaining it to you.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Now, the IEPs, I would just like to talk about that for a little bit. I'm sure when you started teaching, you probably had classes that nobody had an IEP. And now I feel like obviously it's way more common to do that. And it is an extra for the teachers, right, to make sure that they are following them and accommodating the students in the class who have them. What are your thoughts? Any suggestions for teachers or even for parents with a child who has IEP?
Yeah, so the number of kids with IEPs is probably bigger now. I think it's on average about 13% of students now across the nation. But you have schools, some of the schools we work with, I think they're probably at 25% or something like that.
Right.
So there are lots of kids with IEPs, which is challenging. And one of the reasons it's so challenging is because the focus is so much on compliance. It's just, the plan says X, and therefore we're going to be, we're going to be monitored as to whether we're doing X.
Right.
And it doesn't always focus on the things that are the most important. The other thing about IEPs is that usually what happens is an IEP, usually when kids struggle with learning and they have an IEP, there are three things that happen. They get accommodations, which is things like extra time on a test. They get maybe a simpler curriculum. The curriculum gets fewer spelling words or fewer math problems, or you read something at a lower grade reading level or something like that. And then you get compensatory strategies. which are some of the things that we've been really talking about, would be things like getting written and verbal instructions, because one or the other might not be effective.
Mm-hmm.
Now what we know is that there should be a fourth sort of pillar to add to those, which is we actually can help strengthen cognitive skills. So the reason that kids have IEPs is that they have weakness in one or more cognitive skills, at least the vast majority of them. And so what we know now is that we can actually improve those with the right kind of cognitive training. We can improve attention skills. We can improve processing speed. We can improve cognitive flexibility. We can improve reasoning skills. We can improve memory skills. And what we can do for many kids is to get them to the point where they don't need those accommodations. We actually give them the capacity. We close that cognitive gap. We did one study with students with specific learning disabilities, which is people are sort of familiar, I think, with learning disabilities, but this is the largest portion of the population with IEPs. It's about 40%. Mm-hmm. So it's the largest single category. And in this study, students went through a cognitive training program. They worked in the program 30, it's called Brainware Safari, which is our cognitive training program, 30 to 45 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week for 12 weeks. And that kind of intervention resulted in them being tested on a cognitive test and almost closing the gap to what would be considered normally developing for their cognitive skills. And they saw 0.8 of a grade equivalent improvement in reading and a full grade equivalent improvement in math in 12 weeks. So when we strengthen, it's like building our muscles. We're strengthening our learning muscles and we're more capable. Then kids can approach this and they can learn much more like their more typically developing peers. It's much easier. It's easier for the teachers too. That's the other thing, is that if we could help teachers by bringing more students to the classroom better prepared to learn, who had the capacity, who didn't need to be corralled in because they were having learning difficulties and their behavior goes off the wall, it'd be a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that, and then strengthening those cognitive skills. Now, just so we can kind of conceptualize that, what are some of the things that the kids are doing during this 12-week program that are helping them build on those skills? Like, is some of it game-based? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's essentially cognitive therapy in a video game format. And so basically that came from work that had been done in clinics for many, many years. So it incorporates the kind of techniques that people have ever been to a speech pathologist or a vision developmental expert or an occupational therapist. They do some of these kinds of things. But, one example would be a game that gives you, the computer shows you 3 cards and it turns them over so you can see the numbers on them. And then it turns them back over and you have to get the cards into numerical order from smallest to largest. So what that's doing is it's working on your visualization skills, your sequential processing skills, how you get things in the right order. It's helping you work on your working memory, which is how you hold information in your mind while you think about it. And when you do this in different ways, so there are 20 exercises in the program, and each one works on different skills, but they work on skills and some of the same skills, but in different ways and different combinations. And so it's like, I guess the concept's a little bit like, cross training in the gym where you're working on muscle groups and combinations, just as with our brains. So kids feel like they're playing a video game. It uses the best techniques of that. So most of them enjoy it. It does get challenging. when you're learning to do something new, you often get to that point. I'm sure you teach or you do coaching with basketball, you said. All right. And I'm sure you've had kids say, I just cannot dribble that fast, or I cannot dribble with my left hand, or I can't remember to turn this way instead of that way, or whatever it is that whatever skill it is that you're working on. But again, that's we practice and working at it. And it's amazing. Our brains are the concept of neuroplasticity. It's what the scientists call it. It just means that our brains can change. And we now know that our brains can change far more than we ever thought. It's really quite remarkable, the degree to which we can build up these skills. It's really transformational for kids.
Now, you brought up another interesting point there, just talking about neuroplasticity. So, again, I'm familiar with this term, and just kind of to comment on the last point too. A lot of the things that I've been hearing, a lot of the literature and just education I've been doing for coaching, a lot of it's focusing on game-based learning as well. So we've been doing that a lot in our practices, like doing mini games to help the kids learn those skills and really work their way through it when it's challenging for them.
Right. Yeah. There's games are great pedagogy. They're great learning tools, and if they're applied right, I've seen programs that incorporated games, game technology, video game things in them that were just completely gratuitous, that were just, because we're going to throw some characters and some whatever, but if you do it in a way that really gives kids feedback that helps them, keep track of how they're doing, that helps them get motivated just to try that one more time. Those kinds of things can be very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I love to see those games.
Yeah, for sure. Now, the other thing too that you were talking about there was neuroplasticity. So for those who may not understand that concept, can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So neuroplasticity is the term that the scientists use for the fact that our brains can change. It doesn't have anything to do with plastic, other than plastic is malleable. That's why they use that term. But what goes on in our brains and what learning actually is the making and strengthening of connections among all those brain cells that are called neurons. So each one of our brains has about 85 billion neurons. That's a whole lot of neurons. They're these little tiny cells, and you could put 30,000 on them on the head of a pin. But it's not the number of neurons that matters. What matters is all the connections. So we start off with very few connections. So as a baby, we got 85 billion neurons, but not many connections. And by interacting with the environment, our brains wire themselves. So they make these connections between neurons, and neurons can connect to many, many other neurons into neural networks. And a neural network is something where we have a concept, or we have a skill, or we have a whole bunch of neurons that work together. So what neuroplasticity is technically is that we can create new pathways, new connections, and we can get rid of old ones. So you probably can remember pretty vividly when your kids were 2, in the terrible 2 stage. Well, what's happened is that from birth, where there are very few connections, our brains are producing connections at like 1.8 connections per second. And just massive creation of all of these connections. And that's what interacting with the environment does, because it's where we store that information, it's where we build skills, where we try things out. And at the age of 2, we've actually overproduced connections. We have too many connections. And so that's why kids can't figure out what to do. It's just a lot of stuff going on. So they then have to prune away. They have to get rid of those extra connections. And so we do that. And that's what neuroplasticity is, meaning that we can reuse, repurpose, reconnect. We can change our minds, literally. It's the whole, we physically change our brains. Learning is a physical change. Every time as a teacher, or as a teacher's assistant, Tanya, that you are interacting with a child, you are physically changing their brain. And you do as a coach, Brian. And it's a very cool responsibility. It's pretty awesome responsibility. I always try to remember that when I'm working with my class or working with a group of teachers or whatever, that, and then our job as teachers is then to figure out how to create learning experiences that really will make strong connections, where those connections will be durable. They'll be able to recall. They'll be able to connect it to things that they already know, so that it'll be a really strong learning experience.
Excellent. Now, I kind of want to follow up on that and just talk about, we've talked a lot about working memory and now, neuroplasticity. For someone who has challenges with long-term memory, is that affected by maybe their brain's ability to make those connections? I'm just, as you were saying that, it just kind of made me think of that.
Yeah. And so long-term memories, we always talk about memory as if it's just one thing, but there are actually a whole bunch of different stages and things that are going on that help transfer something into long-term memory. And there's this little part of our brain, it has a really goofy name. It's called the hippocampus. And it's because it looks like a seahorse, I guess the Greeks named it. And it's very much involved in turning things into long-term memory. And so, we talked a little bit before also about how to create effective memory, to be able to study and remember something with multiple senses. So that's going to increase the likelihood that we're able to remember information. And by practicing and learning things, you can actually build up your memory. So, and then other things like, I guess it's sort of the same principle. I was thinking something you could probably do with your basketball team. You could, if you decide they need to practice their math facts along with their basketball skills, have them chest pass a basketball back and forth, 5 times 7, 6 times 8. And that actually has been shown to help improve retention of that information.
Excellent. All right. Well, the one thing that we kind of hinted at but didn't really talk about a lot is the book that you co-authored, Your Child Learns Differently, Now What? So can we talk a bit about that before we wrap up for today?
We certainly can. So we have worked with lots and lots of parents and kids over the years, and really have had the amazing good fortune. We've been blessed to be able to watch some of these transformations to help kids learn and become confident, capable learners, going from all the kinds of struggles that we've talked about. And we really wanted to share that. We wanted to share an understanding of how brains learn. Most parents don't know that. Most parents don't know about cognitive skills. Most parents don't know that cognitive skills can be improved. And so we just felt it was really important to share that information. So there are a lot of stories in the book, and there's also a very, we hope, easy to follow plan. It's 5 steps to take the wheel, to take charge. We were talking about that earlier. And then help understanding how your child learns and building cognitive skills. And it goes on from there. But it has a lot of information and a lot of stories too, which I think helps people sort of identify with what people have gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one thing that you just made me remember is I teach part-time as well. And I remember the day of an exam, some of my students were in like a side room just studying. And this is what really made me kind of drove home the point about storytelling for me is
Mm.
the one student asked a question, student didn't remember the answer. And then the other student said, no, do you remember when Brian told this story? And then that was how they were making the correlation. So that really helped with my teaching because I teach at a college and I didn't have a teaching background, so I really just didn't know what I was doing. But the stories really, that helped me make
You
that
did.
correlation.
It turns out you did know what you were doing. You just didn't know you knew it. Storytelling is wonderful. In fact, if you need to remember a list of things, like when you go to the grocery store, if you put it in a little story, visualize the chicken and the eggs and the milk and the whatever it happens to be. Those are very good mnemonic devices, ways of remembering information. And when you tell stories, people do remember them much more than other things.
Mm-hmm. I remember our twins, the last time they were in class together, it was grade 4. And every day they would come home and one would retell the story that and obviously she did this strategically. I'm sure, the story came in with the lesson that was going on and they would recite it at dinner and stuff like that. And it's interesting, right? Because you sit back and be like, okay, they were able to put the 2 and 2 together. Maybe the lesson she was teaching wasn't the most exciting, but they remember by the story that she was sharing with them.
Right. And their retelling it is what really cemented it. So they probably never, it was a lot easier to remember when it came test time.
Exactly. Oh, this has been great, Betsy.
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely. Now, yeah, same. Now, I just want to make sure everybody knows where to find you. So the website, for those who didn't see when we had it flashing down there, and again, it's linked below wherever you're watching or listening, but it's mybrainware, WARE.com. So mybrainware.com. Also, the book is called Your Child Learns Differently. Now What? It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through other retailers as well. And if you want to check them out on YouTube, it's Brainware Learning is the name of the channel. Betsy, I just want to thank you for taking the time with us. And for everyone who watched or listened, we want to thank you for letting us disrupt your everyday.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.